Hey everybody, welcome to the Mother FIGRs Podcast. I'm Caitlin Darkangelo, founder and co-owner of Figure, Midwestern wife, and girl mom. I'm a dual certified pregnancy and postpartum trainer, majored in exercise science from the University of Michigan, earned my master in management degree from Duke University, and have been coaching in the fitness industry for over a decade. This podcast dives into all things pregnancy and postpartum fitness, especially in how to navigate strength and intensity training in these seasons. Whether you're in it yourself, trying to get pregnant, or coaching this population, you're in the right place. I'm excited to share personal experiences, client stories, guest interviews, and evidence-based strategies to give you the guidance, insights, and clarity needed to navigate these seasons with confidence. And with that, let's get rolling. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Mother FIGRs Podcast. Today I'm going to be going into all things like pelvic floor therapy from my own personal experience. I actually plan to get my pelvic floor physical therapist on here so she can talk more of the intricacies of the practice, but I just went for my first time 2 weeks ago now and have been implementing some of the things that we worked on and have seen a night and day difference in symptoms. And so I just wanted to bring you guys through, why I originally reached out to her, what I wanted to work on, what symptoms I was experiencing, what we did in the process actually at the appointment, and then what she had me work on and kind of how I'm doing now. So first wanted to go into just kind of a quick, what is pelvic floor PT, or what can you expect from it? Because I think it still is relatively new to talk about or to know about. A lot of people don't know that it's even a thing. So pelvic floor PT is kind of what it sounds like. You are doing therapy on your pelvic floor. This can be external or internal or both. And so I actually went during Amelia's pregnancy. This was a long time ago, obviously 4 years ago. And it was just kind of a very basic checkup kind of appointment. So that was less in depth. This one was more in depth. But at that original first one that I went to 4 years ago, it was all external. So what they did was assess, hip tension, glute strength, glute tension, your basic alignment, even all the way up to your shoulders, how that aligns through your back and your low back, because low back pain can be highly correlated with pelvic floor issues. At this specific appointment that I just had, we also worked on some gait mechanics and general muscle tension through my quads, which I'll talk about too, which we found that those were tight as well. But so pelvic floor PT, they do an external assessment of other areas that aren't just related to your pelvic floor, or not just your pelvic floor, but are related to. And then there also can be an internal pelvic floor examination and manual therapies that go into that. This is something that not all pelvic floor appointments will have. Some pelvic floor physical therapists will be trained in internal or not. So it's highly individualized and depending on the therapist that you go see, and also dependent on the symptoms that you're experiencing. So just high level, pelvic floor PT kind of assesses other areas that are in connection with the pelvic floor from an external perspective, and can be an internal assessment of the pelvic floor itself. So I went to go see Liesle. She is a local pelvic floor therapist in the Brighton area. She has a gait core therapy. Again, I want to bring her on and we'll go through her whole story there, but she was great and I wanted to just go through her specific process. She was actually recommended to me by one of my own pregnancy clients, and I originally reached out to her because I wanted to connect with her just on a business, connections, collaboration level, because she had recommended that my pregnant client continue trying to load her core and to do things like sit-ups or core flexion, different plank stuff, to continue doing that as long as she could during pregnancy. And me being on the fitness side of things, where that is kind of newer information in the fitness space when it comes to pregnancy, I knew that if a pelvic floor therapist was already up to date with current fitness practices, that was going to be a really good match, not just for me, but also for my clients who want to stay active throughout their pregnancy. And they need a pelvic floor physical therapist, or just people who work with pregnancy in general, like whether that be massage, chiro, whatever, that are up to date on fitness practices and helps my clients stay active in the activities that they want to do. So I knew immediately that she was going to be awesome. So I reached out to her. I had a whole 2-hour meeting with her a few weeks prior when I was earlier on in my own pregnancy, and we just hit it off really well, and she was just awesome. Another way I knew that she was going to be great was in her practice. She actually has a full squat rack machine. She has kettlebells. She has bands. She has ways to load the body and mirror the activities that you want to be able to do in her own office. And that is really important because when we're on the bed in a physical therapy appointment, obviously it's great. We need to start with the basics. We need to connect to our core. We need to do all the manual therapy work. But if we don't mirror activities that we are going to try to do without symptoms, we're not going to get better at that. So having a pelvic floor physical therapist that has the ability to recreate scenarios that you want to be able to do without pain is a huge plus. So in terms of pelvic floor physical therapy too, on a broader scale, it can help with a lot of things, whether you have symptoms or not. So during pregnancy, if you are not experiencing symptoms, pelvic floor physical therapy can also be helpful for things like labor prep when it comes to positions or pelvic floor relaxation techniques. And then it can also help with, just symptoms that I will explain as well during pregnancy. For postpartum specifically, it's common to see pelvic floor physical therapists after birth, technically, is a lot of times when you'll start to hear about it, or after the birth actually happens, to help with the injury to that area, whether that be with prolapse, incontinence, tearing, all different kinds of things, pelvic pains, and even C-section healing. I have a pelvic floor physical therapist come into my postpartum class and do like a little 20-minute spiel before our class starts. And one of the biggest responses I've heard from my own clients are like, oh, I didn't even know pelvic floor physical therapists can help you with C-section scar healing and things like that. So that's just one thing I wanted to cover really quickly, is that they can actually help with C-section mobility and manual therapies and stuff like that. Obviously, different pelvic floor physical therapists will have different, capabilities or training. So obviously find one that specializes or can do C-section, but just in general. So that's kind of pelvic floor therapy in a nutshell. But I wanted to talk about my side, or how I experience it, and kind of what I originally wanted to do in the meeting or in the consultation, all that kind of stuff. So I initially called. First, we had our business meeting a few weeks prior to this. And then it was kind of around that week, like 17 to 20 of my pregnancy. I'm currently 27 weeks right now. But I initially called because I was experiencing heaviness in like the middle of my pelvic floor, specifically after walking in the morning or being on my feet for a prolonged periods of time. So also within this podcast episode, I wanted to touch on just basic pelvic floor principles, things that are very high level. But from a high level perspective, the pelvic floor is just a group of muscles, and it runs from your pubic bone from the front all the way down to the tailbone in your back. And it's kind of like this trampoline structure of muscles. So there's the front, there's a back, there's a middle, there's quadrants, there's different areas of the pelvic floor that can be experiencing different symptoms. So I personally was experiencing a little bit more heaviness or pressure in what I thought was the middle of my pelvic floor after fatigue. So after walks in the morning, after runs in the morning, after being on my feet for a long time. And I knew that I should be able to walk without symptoms. And I knew that the fact that I was experiencing heaviness just because I was on my feet for, 2 to 3 hours, I should be able to do that without symptoms. And so I wanted more clarity about why that was happening, and was curious about what I could be missing, because I'm conscious of breath work, of pelvic floor stuff. I do a lot of pelvic floor relaxation within my Figure Pregnancy program. I am very good at functionally training my whole body system, so my glutes and hamstrings and quads and things. And so I just knew that I was missing something. There was something missing there. I also experienced this same heaviness, not just after my walks, but also in a low squat hold, which is like my favorite labor prep position. I did it with Amelia. I was able to hold it for about 10 minutes when I was pregnant with Amelia. And I swear by it for helping with baby positioning, pelvic floor relaxation, and like getting labor going, opening up the hips. That's a whole nother podcast that we can talk about, labor prep positions. But I could barely hold it for like a minute now because I was experiencing so much pressure and like heaviness. And it was just frustrating to me because I was like, I should not be feeling this. I never felt heaviness during my postpartum journey at all, from even after like the initial 6 weeks or so of early postpartum, all throughout as I was getting back into high intensity and weights, never felt any heaviness. So this was the first time I was starting to feel that. So I just knew something was up. In terms of other symptoms I was also experiencing on top of the heaviness, or what I feel like the heaviness was also causing, was a little bit of some incontinence when I was sneezing sometimes. It wasn't every time, but enough for me to be like, this is more than I should be, because I used to never sneeze or never pee when I sneeze, but now I was starting to. And I noticed that that was happening more, the more heaviness symptoms that I felt. And then also when I was doing like position changes, so like for instance, the first thing in the morning when I was laying down in my bed to going into standing, that like horizontal to vertical position change would sometimes cause like just leaking. And I was like, this is not normal either. And this is, I should not, it was almost like my pee was like pooling and then would just like squeeze out. So like the heaviness made me just feel weird. All things I knew that should not be happening. And it was just like only in everyday life activities. It was never during exercise. So like from what I felt or my experience, it was almost like in the gym when I was conscious of things and when I was training from like I was inhaling, exhaling, I was being able to lengthen and engage my pelvic floor multiple times during a movement, like or during a workout. That was favorable. But in my active daily life, walking, sitting, whatever, that was the kind of activities that almost like, I don't know, it just caused the symptoms. So it was just weird. So no exercises were feeling off besides that low squat hold. Like I could do heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, all this stuff, but it was just that fatigue feeling that over time, my pelvic floor would just kind of like wonk out. So that was why I called initially. And some people call during pregnancy just as like preventative, again, for that labor prep, but I was experiencing some specific symptoms that I wanted to be addressed. So now kind of going into the process of going into the clinic, when I got there, we talked about my symptoms for about 20 minutes. And I had taken mental notes over the last like 2 to 3 weeks leading up to that appointment, so I could have more details around when symptoms were happening, what kind of symptoms I was experiencing, things that made it better or worse, or anything that could be like potentially correlated to those symptoms, which was great for myself to take note of so I could try to assess the situation a little bit myself. But it's also helpful for her as the PT to get more specific with the approach to her treatment for me and giving her a better starting spot of like, okay, let's start here. Let's like kind of figure this out first. So after we did our initial chat, she did an external evaluation. So she started at my shoulders, kind of aligned and wanted to see if everything was set up properly or aligned properly, into my mid back, looking for tension, looking for any asymmetries, and then low back as well in a seated position. And then she had me lay on my back and go into like more hip alignment. So she made sure my like feet were equal with each other, all the, just kind of outside analyzing how my body was set up essentially. She also did things like hip flexor and other muscle tension evaluations, and then like a walking and a gait analysis, because all of this can play into your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor is literally like your deepest layer of stability. So it is anticipatory. So before you go into any kind of movement, whether it be walking or a heavy barbell, your pelvic floor is the first thing to turn on. So everything that your body does is correlated to the pelvic floor, which is why I love that she did this like full external evaluation to see how my whole body is moving as a system. So during that analysis, she noticed that I had some left hip or quad tightness. So we did some different stretches to address that. And that I noticed felt better, like specifically focusing on my left side. So just like traditional quad stretches, things on the ground, things that I can easily add into my daily life. After that external evaluation, she then did an internal evaluation, which was the first time that I had ever had that done. And it might sound like super cringy to some, but this is literally like what they do on a daily basis. And it helps so much for them to have that cue of what's actually happening in the muscle that is causing certain symptoms. So it was really helpful feedback for myself and for her as a therapist. So another thing to note too is like the pelvic floor is just like any other muscle. So if you can have tightness in the muscle, you can have weakness. You want it to go through its full range of motion. So it's literally just like as if you were evaluating like your shoulder for certain injuries or symptoms. It's the same thing. The pelvic floor is literally just a group of muscles. So for me, the internal evaluation was about like 5 or 10 minutes. And I wanted to kind of, go through the pelvic floor on a high level before we get into the rest of the stuff. But in terms of the pelvic floor, it's, like I said, just a group of muscles that sit at the bottom of your pelvis. So if you like see like one of those skeleton pictures, there's like the bony pelvis and the femurs that come out of it. There has to be something at the bottom of that pelvis, the bony pelvis, to keep everything together. And that's what your pelvic floor is. It's pretty much just holding all your shit together is what it does. It first acts like a trampoline. So as air or pressure comes into the core cavity, your pelvic floor responds by lowering and lengthening. So on the inhales, you're like literally expanding through the pelvic floor. This is all happening naturally. And then as you exhale, it responds to that pressure change and to the diaphragm, which I'll get into a whole another podcast about this, but just in general, exhale, as you exhale or as air leaves, it kind of creates this like pressure gap. And so the pelvic floor rises again in response. And just as somebody jumping on like a trampoline, the pressure goes down, the pelvic floor responds down. And if that person that's jumping on the trampoline comes out of that, the pelvic floor goes back up. So it's just this like feedback of pressure in, pelvic floor lowers and lengthens, pressure goes out, pelvic floor comes back up. So that's kind of like one of its jobs. It's also making sure that our organs stay in our body. It also has sphincters around our holes to control the holes for things like pee, poop, sexual function. So it's kind of surrounding these sphincters, which can control all of those things that we do on a daily basis. There's also, I think it's like 30 or 32 different muscles that make up the pelvic floor, and you can have symptoms in different quadrants of the pelvic floor too. So you could have tightness and weakness at different parts within the pelvic floor. And yeah, so there's just like a lot that's going on. So from my perspective as a fitness professional, I don't have to know all the muscles of the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor therapist, however, does know all those muscles and can literally feel the quadrants and front, back, side, like they can feel everything. And that's why it's really good feedback to have, even if you kind of know a lot about the pelvic floor, to have that internal assessment. So that's kind of why the internal piece is really important. So I'll do a whole podcast on like the pelvic floor when it relates to exercise and stuff, but just wanted to highlight all that as a starting point. So anyways, since the pelvic floor is a muscle, when she started on the internal exam, she was first testing for a few things. First was tension. So like if she felt any tightness anywhere, the strength or my ability to do a Kegel, which is just a fancy word for a pelvic floor contraction. So she was testing, she would have me exhale to engage the pelvic floor and see if my Kegel was, strong or appropriate. She was also looking for my ability to relax and lengthen the pelvic floor, because that is a huge piece for labor and for just getting that muscle to work functionally. And she was also looking for the coordination or the timing of that muscle contraction, of the lengthening, seeing if I could do it at the appropriate time. So she kind of started on this is all internal, but kind of on the more superficial layer of things. And then she went into like a deeper layer and tried to like do the same test. And when she was testing muscle tension in the back, deeper area of my pelvic floor, she hit a point that literally gave me that same feeling of heaviness that what I felt like was kind of prolapsy from, like, I know the definition of prolapse, but I've never felt it before, but that was like kind of the feeling that I was getting. And for those who don't know what prolapse is, it's literally just a descent of one or more of the pelvic organs into the vaginal canal. So it's not your organs actually leaving your body. It's just putting like downward pressure into the vaginal canal. So it's creating this like, prolapsy or like pushing sensation or heaviness, downward pressure into your vaginal canal. So that's what I felt like I was feeling. But when she hit that point of tension, it gave me that same exact feeling of that heaviness. So I was like, this is interesting. I had never even considered that tension could create feelings of prolapse. I thought muscle tension and like incontinence were related, but I knew that muscle tension and incontinence were related, but didn't realize that tension and prolapse could be related, because a lot of times prolapse is from like a weakness of the pelvic floor. The pelvic organs are kind of like descending into the area. So there's like a lack of strength essentially. Anyways. So the other piece that was interesting is what I thought was heaviness kind of in that middle of my pelvic floor was actually at the very front of my pelvic floor. So my perception of where the symptoms were occurring were actually wrong. And I was essentially like squeezing the whole back of my pelvic floor. And that was like essentially making that back of the pelvic floor useless in helping manage pressure and tension, or manage pressure in general. So the pressure would all come to the front of my pelvic floor and create those feelings of heaviness and incontinence there. So if you think of your pelvic floor as a bowl, this is going to be really difficult for me to explain, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can kind of see the horrible image that I'm going to try to explain with my hands. So if your pelvic floor is like a bowl and the back half is tight and like not moving, the pressure is just going to be going down in that front of the pelvic floor. So when we release that tension in the back of our pelvic floor, we now have the whole bowl or the whole system working together and working in sync to manage pressure. So now I essentially have all of my pelvic floor muscles with the ability and the functionality to manage pressure instead of just the front. So that's why it was super critical for us to find that there was tension in the back half of my pelvic floor. And that's what was creating this feeling of heaviness in the front of my pelvic floor. Again, I knew the pelvic floor went all the way back to the tailbone, but immediately when she told me that, I was able to kind of like breathe into my butt, essentially, was the cue that I like to now use on myself and now with others. And when I did that, I realized how much space back there actually was to breathe into. I was literally only breathing into like the middle and the front of my pelvic floor. And that was just not sufficient enough to manage the pressure that I needed, especially with the weight of this baby. And so that was super critical information to know where the pressure or where the tension was coming from, and that was creating my feelings of heaviness. It was just a super eye-opening, thing to experience. So again, when the back half is tense, it kind of puts pressure down in the front, and it allows for like the front not to get blunted or like having to do all the workload. So for me, overall, after that experience, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, like we can work on tension. Like I know how to release that and everything. We can do that from breath work, pressure management, that kind of stuff, which I'll get into. But for me, pelvic floor therapy as a whole was helpful for two main reasons. One, it showed me where symptoms actually were versus what I perceived them to be. So before going in there, I thought I had some degree of prolapse, which I did have a minor degree of prolapse, but I don't want to say an exact percentage, but a lot of, if not the majority of moms experience some kind of prolapse after having a baby. But that was not actually what was causing my symptoms. So it showed me not only where, but what symptoms I was actually experiencing. So what I thought was the middle of my pelvic floor / the back of my pelvic floor experiencing heaviness. What it actually was posterior pelvic floor tightness that was putting pressure on symptoms that were actually at the very front of my pelvic floor. So that was number one. Number two, it gave me direction and clarity on what to work on. So it gave me that peace of mind in a sense that prolapse wasn't the diagnosis, it was tension. So now I'm working on the correct things going forward. And it gave me tools and things to focus on for like my specific scenario. So what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks since that appointment was, like I said, the cue breathing into my butt. I do this consciously throughout the whole day, not just during exercise. And I actually barely even have applied anything throughout my exercise. I haven't changed a single piece of my training, but throughout the course of my day, I've just been trying to stay conscious of when I'm like clenching my butt cheeks, and it's actually a lot. So like if I'm just standing doing the dishes, like I'll, the thought will click in my head like, oh, like let's see if you're clenching. And majority of the time I'm doing this all subconsciously, like throughout the day when I'm sitting in the car, when I'm even just doing this podcast, like I'll have to like consciously think about releasing, brushing my teeth. I've told clients this for literally my whole coaching career. It's not just what you do with me for the 1 hour that you're in the gym. It's the 23 other hours that are going to add up for the most like effectiveness of either progress or, getting symptoms and like, detrimental habits. And I have felt that to a personal degree so much in these last 2 weeks. And I cannot tell you how much of a night and day difference that has made in my my symptoms. I haven't had any incontinence since doing that. I have barely felt any of that heaviness. It's still progressively getting better. But like if I was at, let's say 100% when I called in, or like when I went there, I'm at like a 20% already within 2 weeks. And that's without adding exercises, removing exercises, changing my workout routine in any way. It's all because of the change in pressure management and releasing tension that I have been working on. So when I go through my postpartum class and in my app program, and I talk about this on social media, how important it is for like pelvic floor alignment, pelvic floor breathing and relaxation techniques, pressure management, like that is the important stuff. Although it is like boring to work on and annoying, and you just want to do all the like high intensity stuff, and you want me to give you a specific exercise that'll fix X problem, that tension and pressure management is by far like the most important piece to your symptom management. And so take that stuff seriously from the beginning, during pregnancy and postpartum. And I guarantee it'll help those symptoms so much. It wasn't about like, the newest pelvic floor exercise or like the new crazy technique or like the thing you see on Instagram of like this really special exercise or movement pattern. It's literally just the basics. And I can't stress that enough, that muscle tension, pressure management, it's not exciting. It's not new. It's not what gets the most attention, but is the most important, component to managing your symptoms and feeling awesome and being able to do what you love during pregnancy and then getting back to it postpartum. And that's literally why I made my brand, why I made this podcast, really is to cut through all the fancy stuff like that and just give you the techniques, the tips, and the tools that actually work and that you can apply to yourself in whatever area of activity it is that you love to do. So I will actually drop Liesle's info in the notes of this podcast for those in the Brighton area who want to reach out to her or who are trying to find a good pelvic floor physical therapist. And then I also plan on going into depth with her about pelvic floor physical therapy on the podcast. So I am excited to have her on, whenever she gets on. But in general, I hope my personal experience kind of brings some insight for you, whether you are interested in going to pelvic floor physical therapy, if you were just curious about it, or maybe it just gave you some good cues or things to think about with your own pelvic floor when you go through pregnancy. And then obviously postpartum is a whole nother ball game, but a lot of the same principles apply. And with that, I will see you guys in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Mother FIGRs Podcast. If these episodes help or resonate with you in any way, it would be so helpful to the show if you could leave a review so we can get this into more moms' hands. And if you're looking for even more guidance and direction when it comes to pregnancy and postpartum fitness, I got you covered. My Mother FIGRs app subscription includes my Figure Pregnancy and Figure Postpartum workout programs, in addition to our general fitness programs. You'll get the day-by-day workouts you need to help you feel strong, pain-free, and labor-ready during pregnancy, and also the recovery, strength, and progressions you'll need to get back to the activities you love, full of strength and without symptoms after baby arrives. If you're local to the Brighton, Michigan area, I also host daily women's functional fitness classes, a 6-week postpartum return to fitness course, and pregnancy and postpartum consultation sessions. For those who are providers, coaches, or practitioners in the space, I hold a live Mother FIGRs certification course that equips you with the knowledge, tools, and confidence to train and work with this population. For information on all of these services and programs, make sure to check out fitisgettingreal.com/moms or head to the show notes for the direct link. I'm so thankful that you tuned in today's episode, and I will catch you next time.